repair we're going to do today is for a stitch through construction down jacket. It's quite easy. I'm going to show you the simplest way possible of repairing this jacket. To carry out this repair, you're going to need some tailor's chalk, a stitch ripper, some tailor's scissors, and some 10 to 15 denier fabric of a similar colour to that of your down jacket. I'm going to use an industrial sewing machine in this video, but a domestic sewing machine is more than suitable. So the first step of this repair is doing a bit of seam ripping. We're going to want to remove the elastic cuff on the outside of this seam. We're also going to want to unpick what is here a thin binding material which runs along the inside of the sleeve seam. Trying to keep the binding in as good a shape as possible while we're doing that, because we'll try to re-sew it on. So with the elasticated cuff, we're gonna probably just replace this afterwards. It's very hard to unpick this elastic without ruining it, so don't worry too much about that. So the next seam to unpick is this binding seam. Now I'm going to try my best to unpick this, keeping the binding intact, because I will want to reuse this binding. So I'm as far along as I need to go really with this sleeve seam. I can basically lay flat the area that I'm working on. And the next step now is to start putting the fabric on. The method I'm going to use here on the sleeve, I don't actually need to worry about pre-cutting the fabric at all. Just to make it slightly easier to work with, I'm going to cut a very rough kind of square of fabric that I can work on. I'm going to place up to this seam here because I can just see a few holes there, and I'm just going to perhaps just give it a bit of a mark with some chalk. What I'm effectively wanting to do is to attach this bit of fabric over this layer of the sleeve, but what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to set up the fabric loosely in place like this, and I'm just going to fold the sleeve over like that, and making sure I remember the marking on it. Lovely. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to follow the baffle seam on the inside layer of the jacket sleeve, and that's going to be how I'm going to attach it to the jacket, and just try and follow that seam along. Try and keep the sleeve stretched while you do it. You don't want to let the sleeve cinch in too much, because the fabric you're sewing onto won't be cinched in either. Okay, so now I've sewn along here. I'll flip the jacket over to the outside layer. You can see that I've got all this fabric that I can trim off. I'd leave at least 1 centimetre seam tolerance after it, which is great. And then if you see, I fold this over right now, it's going to cover this section of the jacket. And my next step is to just top stitch this seam so it's nice and flush with the jacket. So keeping it nice and close, I'd perhaps use the middle bit of this seam as the guide on my presser foot. And keep it nice and stretched out. Lovely. So you can start to see this taking shape now. We've got our new fabric panel over the jacket. We've got our top stitch in. The next step is just making sure that we sew the ends of the sleeve in place with the fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flick it over again, and keeping the outside bit of the jacket nice and stretched out. I'm just going to pop that there out of the way. I'm just going to sew down these seams, and then I'm going to sew along this seam. So at this point, stop here. It's tempting to run along this seam. Don't do that, because the chances are you won't have stretched this end of the sleeve out enough. So stop at that point, snip your thread, and then just move over to the other side, and again just starting from the top seam, nice and stretched out here. Lovely. And then the only bit we have left now is to go along the outside, the top bit of this sleeve. Right, so we've sewn this fabric layer over the outer, and literally all you need to do is just snip along the seam of the sleeve. Lovely, and it's really starting to come together now. Right, so now I want to sew the baffle seams along the sleeve, and I'm gonna do that quite similarly to how I sewed the fabric on to start with. I'm gonna sew along the inside layer, and I'm just gonna line up my seams on top of the original baffle seams. The next step is now to sew the inside sleeve seam together. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to unpick the binding a bit further back from the seam, just so it's easier for me to sew the seam without the binding getting in the way. So I'm just unpicking the binding here. Great, so we can see where the seam starts. So I'm just going to pull this out, this sleeve out, just to check that I've not pinched any of the fabric. And yeah, there we go. So it's sewn in nicely. And the next step now is just to bind it. So this section is quite a fiddly bit because we're reusing the same binding. Just like with the seam, if you see any stray bits of thread, do pick them out, because you don't want them in your binding. And one final thing to do before we add the binding now is just to trim along here, making sure that any excess fabric in the seam is trimmed flush with the original fabric. Remember, the binding's main job is just to stop the edges of the fabric fraying. So it doesn't need to be too pretty, but it's always good to aim for perfection when you do these kind of things. That's on, that's good. That's going to stop the inside seam from fraying. The only thing left to do now is to put the elasticated cuff back on the jacket. I'm going to use this 40mm binding, and that's just because it's what I've got. So I'm going to cut it to here. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to cut two bits, because obviously it's a different type of cuff. Different type of elastic on the cuff. I want it matching on the other side. So just give it a quick go over with a lighter, just to make sure you kind of hold it in place. It is a woven fabric, this. So now I'm just going to sew them together on the sewing machine like this. So remember, this is the actual outside layer of the jacket, and that's the bit we want to make sure that the binding's most neat on, the elastic's most neat on. And it's worth starting from the point that you've got the seam of the elastic on, so you can make sure it's tucked in and out of the way. Going to make sure the outside part of the presser foot is running, so the centre of it is lining up with the edge of the binding. So here we go, this is the finished article, the repaired sleeve, where the new fabric starts, finishes. We've put a cuff on the ends, a new elasticated cuff. I've also gone around, I have not even bothered unpicking the original cuff on this side, but I've just put another cuff over this sleeve just so they don't look mismatched. Thanks for watching the Summiteer Repair Shop. If there's anything you'd like to see us repair in the future, leave it in the comments and we'll look into it. We'll see you soon.